This lecture is to provide an introduction for PSY 320, Lifespan Development. So lifespan development is exactly what it says it is. How do we understand how humans change over the course of their lifespan? How does life begin? How do we begin as a single cell and grow into a complex adult? What's the role of influence on our lives and how we influence other lives? And how does that change people's perspectives over the course of their development over the course of time as they gain new skills, learn new information, develop and begin to expand their competencies to engage in the world? How does that affect them? How do they do that? What role does identity and different kind of roles, social roles, do people take, and how does that affect development? And then as we look at at the end of our lives, how does death shape how we deal with our life, and how do we cope with death and dying? So basically, human development, developmental psychology is a very interdisciplinary approach to understanding how humans change over the course of time, as this slide says here, and which means that developmental psychologists actually learn a lot about cognitive development, how people's cognitive processes work, and how they change over time. There is a lot of physiological psychology, looking at the body and the brain and how those changes in one's soma, one's body, influence things. And then, of course, there are personality contributions from personality psychology. So human development and developmental psychology is a very interdisciplinary aspect of psychology. So some of the recurring issues in human development, and these kinds of dichotomies, and we'll talk about more than these three, really shape how we understand human existence, and especially in the United States. So life and being a human is shaped by a complex set of factors, and so we can think about factors such as nature versus nurture, how much of human development is innate, caused by our genetic code, and how our biological processes unfold in our lives, compared to what we learn and how the social context influences us. And do those things differentiate and change over the course of time? Maybe at certain points of our life, nurture is more pressing and permanent, whereas at other points, nature is more pressing and permanent. Continuity and discontinuity. So this is how people develop over the course of their lifespans. Most of our psychological theories view development from a discontinuous perspective. Think about a stage model, as we'll spend a lot of time talking about Erik Erikson throughout this course, and Sigmund Freud and Jean Piaget. They have stage models where you are functioning at a certain level, and then there is a qualitative shift as you gain competence and skills and then move into the next level. So, for example, for Erikson's model, you resolve the conflict between these two developmental processes, and then that helps you move on to the next stage. But it's a discontinuous shift. So metaphorically speaking, this is the same kind of shift. It's a qualitative shift, like when your car shifts gears. When you go from first to second gear, the actual nature of the engine in your car and the transmission changes. And so that would be a discontinuous understanding. Continuous approaches are becoming more and more relevant in the study of developmental psychology. The most beneficial one, I believe, is called oscillation theory, and it views people as attaining certain competencies throughout the course of their life, and in sometimes if you would take a snapshot, people were more or less competent based on how where they're at, and could be combining their genetic influences along with the social context that they are at. And one other important thing to think about is trying to identify what are universal developmental processes that apply to all people on the earth for example, all humans, and what are context-specific aspects of development that would be highly cultural, neighborhood, value-dependent. And so there's this tension between the universal and the context-specific. We can also think about these patterns as being at the highest level, the meta-theoretical level. So when Sigmund Freud constructed his model, what are the theoretical concepts and perspectives he used, for example, to develop his model? So we talked about discontinuous versus continuous change already. From a cognitive structural perspective, what does that mean? Well, cognitive structural theory talks about the need for certain brain structures to be developed before certain cognitive capacities can exist or happen. So, for example, the cognitive structural approaches to lifespan or developmental psychology, Piaget is the big one here. And we'll talk a lot about his theory, and Lawrence Kohlberg is another one. And both Kohlberg and Piaget talk about how the brain needs to have achieved a certain developmental stage in order to support the cognitive structures and components needed to attain various levels, whether that's a moral developmental level or a cognitive developmental level. For those of you who know who James Fowler is, who is a very influential developmental psychologist who studied how faith develops over the course of one's life, they adopted this perspective about the role of the human body and the brain in influencing development. We can also think about developmental progress versus decline, how some inherent in a lot of developmental models is this idea that humans are flourishing and developing and attaining certain skills and abilities. And then, of course, there's also the decline perspective on that. There's also this idea of individuality versus relationality, which will be highlighted when we talk a little bit about Freud, and his focus much more on the person, the individual developing throughout his or her lifespan, compared to other developmental theorists like Erik Erikson and some others that really understand human development as a contextual synergy between the person, the self, the individual, and his or her relational context. And so this idea is individuality versus community or relationship, drive reduction versus relational orientation. So this perspective is crucial. It drives a lot of our psychological theories, but especially lifespan, where the drive reduction is about satisfying psychological needs or drives, the need for affection, the need for love, the need to produce, those kinds of things. And so Erik Erikson and Sigmund Freud are much more in this drive reduction perspective, where there will be an object that satisfies that psychological need, and then attaining that relieves the psychic pressure. So that reduces that drive. Whereas other theorists are much more relationship focused and contextual, and see that human development is about building these connections among people and individuals, and how that in itself is a goal. Now, at the broadest perspective, what each developmental theorist and theory that we'll talk about is a unique vision for human flourishing. There is a moral perspective in all of these developmental models, and how we discern what their developmental teleology, that is their ultimate goal for human life, is by looking, especially in the stage models, at their very final stage. So if we look at Freud, and he's looking at the adult genital stage of development, or Erik Erikson, and he's looking at integrity versus despair, what we see is that those perspectives identify what is the ultimate in human flourishing, and how that what that means for those of us that are trying to get there. All right, so the developmental teleology is important because it identifies this goal, this value, this image of the ideal. And when we talk about things from a Christian perspective, That's the level that we're going to engage at. Is Freud's idea of human flourishing as described by his ultimate stage of human development? How does that relate to what we would understand from a Christian worldview perspective? And so some of our discussions in our videos and our online discussion boards will be focused on those kinds of questions. So returning to nature versus nurture, are personal characteristics inherited or brought about by the environment? Those kinds of things. And really how things shape in people's personalities and their interactions. So we can distill some of this down to 4 interactive forces that are guiding and supporting that affect human development. Now, there are biological forces, hormones, kind of how we go from a single-cell creature to an elementary school student. There are a lot of biological building blocks that influence human development. Of course, these biological development forces are influenced to an extent by psychological factors, personal values, perspectives, desires, motivations, things like cognition, those kinds of things. And then, of course, all of these things happen in a sociocultural context. How one's neighborhood, one's ethnic group, one's family of origin shape both the psychological forces as well as the biological. And then, of course, there are life cycle forces in terms of how we understand human development to go from cradle to grave, so to speak. We can see nodal events happen, things that are that humans experience, like language acquisition. And how those forces, how those are natural life cycle stages that influence these biological, psychological, and sociocultural factors. So, taken together, these factors are called the biopsychosocial model or framework. And so, as we're progressing and processing through this class, just keep that in the back of the mind that we might be focusing specifically on cognitive development, but there are lots of biological and sociocultural and life cycle factors that are influencing what we're saying about cognitive development that way. And so we can all see how these factors inform the life cycle forces that result in how people change over the course of their lives. Neuroscience in this process plays a huge role. And so we're getting more and more sophisticated in our ability to understand how one's brain influences behavior and how behavior influences brain. It's a reciprocal relationship that way. And so we can, incorporate more neurological and neuroscientific evidence in influencing how we develop over time. Psychodynamic theory is perhaps the most influential theory of human development. Now, again, as we're thinking about this, both Erik Erikson and Sigmund Freud's theories are inherently heuristic. They provide useful tools to conceptualize human development. Erik Erikson is probably the most influential development, and there are many understandings and perspectives of how his theory has influenced lifespan development. For example, Dan McAdams, who is a very well-known personality psychologist, has built his personality theory on Erik Erikson's approach and understanding, which is very cool. Erik Erikson's model is almost impossible to empirically verify, but it does provide a good heuristic idea of how things develop. Now, Erikson's theory is based on epigenetics, which is really important. People tend to view nature and nurture as a dichotomous, kind of separate and distinct category. Epigenetics, on the other hand, describes how not only do genes influence the environment, but the environment influences the genes, and there's this reciprocal influence that happens between these two things. So Erik Erikson was groundbreaking back when he was writing, and epigenetics has taken on a new influence and a new interest in current psychology. So these are Erik Erikson's life stages, and we'll spend a lot of time with them later in the course, but for right now, what we can see here is basic trust versus mistrust. So his model, Erik Erikson's model, has two poles of a continuum: trust, mistrust. And as the baby begins to emerge and develop, these two forces, basic trust versus mistrust, create psychic drives, right, and motivation, and the child needs to resolve this conflict. And once the child, around the age of 1, has a basic sense of trust as compared to mistrust, then the world begins to be understood in terms of it being a good place, right? And so that level of that first level of trust versus mistrust forms the foundation for all the other levels. Now, and as people begin to move on. So autonomy versus shame. The individual, as they resolve this challenge to realize one is an independent person that can affect the world, sometimes what that results in, though, is mistakes are made. And at a young age, that sense of shame becomes about the person. I'm wrong for doing that, so to speak. And so we develop a sense of autonomy. But there's also the next stage then building on top of that is initiative versus guilt. So as one's moral perspective begins to develop, transgressing those perspectives results in guilt. And so the person then begins to take more initiative. I like to do these things. I like to do that. I don't like that one so much. And so that the person begins to take a sense of initiative or the ability to try new things and to manage and cope with failure. As we get into the school age, there's a sense of industry and they can develop learning basic skills and the ability to work with others. But in expanding the social environment, one learns that one might not be the best there ever is in every category, which could result in a sense of inferiority. So learning how to manage social evaluation and comparison is important here. When we get into adolescence, identity versus identity confusion becomes a critical issue. Identifying who we are as individuals and what we want to accomplish and what we want to do, and how we how those things play out throughout the rest of our lives, as opposed to losing our sense of self and identity. When we get into young adulthood, of course, intimacy and isolation develop, which is followed by generativity and stagnation, and then finally integrity versus despair. Again, we'll spend a lot of time on these throughout the remainder of the course. Just know that this framework, this heuristic, is really important, and it has had a humongous influence on psychology, not just developmental psychology, but psychology in general, personality development, things like that. Additionally, another approach is to understand learning theory and learning behavior. Here we're talking about Skinner, who talks about consequences of behavior and social token economies and how we can condition people to, which influences their likelihood of reproducing certain behaviors in certain situations. And then the learning theory, social learning theory by Albert Bandura, which was widely influential in many circles. So, in terms of the cognitive components of development, Jean Piaget was a very important and is a very important theorist here. One of the cool things about Piaget's theory is that it was qualitative in nature, how he developed it, and he developed it by observing his own children. And his focus was on how children create theories about the world and then test them out. So the metaphor for Piaget is that individuals are little mini scientists conducting micro experiments to understand how they develop over time cognitively. So we can think about information processing theory as an important component of this. How cognition consists of mental hardware and software, cognitive structures for the mental hardware and software, cognitive processes. And so how specifically does the brain influence the ability, the cognitive processes that we engage with to develop cognitively? And Vygotsky is another theorist that argues that every aspect of child's development must be considered as a cultural component. And so Vygotsky is looking at the social context and how that is fundamentally important, and more so even in human general human principles. And so, and of course, Vygotsky had interactions a little bit with Jean Piaget. They're approaching things from very different perspectives. So Piaget was highly influential in cognitive psychology, and here before us is his theory with 4 stages. So sensor-motor stage is the first stage. Infants' knowledge of the world is based on their senses and motor skills. So how they learn epistemologically and how they know things is through their empirical senses, taste, touch, sight, things like that. And over the course of time, they gain the ability for object constancy. That is, their ability to develop mental representations that we can, through language development and through their experiences, they've been able to understand that there's a dog concept, for example, and we can talk generally about the dog. And so they don't have to see the dog, right? They don't have to have this empirical experience of the dog to be able to have a discussion about them, for example. Pre-operational thought is said to be from 2 to 6 years. The child learns how to use symbols like words, numbers to represent aspects of the world, object constancy, but primarily that this child relates to the world only through his or her perspective. It's highly, pre-operational thought is conceptual, right? We have language, but it's very egocentric. I caused the earthquake. I caused the car wreck. I caused this. I caused it. Right? So there's this fanciful egocentrism. And children in this stage have a hard time of perspective taking. They can't understand what another person would see from a different vantage point. Then they transition to concrete operational thought, where the child understands and applies logical operations to experiences, provided they are focused on the here and now. So it's a very existentially pressing or immediate kind of experience. And then sometimes children are able to deduce and use logical operations about their experiences to take other people's perspectives. Formal operational thought happens in adolescence and beyond. People think abstractly, deal with hypothetical situations, and speculations about what's possible. Another important perspective as we're thinking about different various developmental theories is an ecological approach. And so the ecological approach looks at human development as components of nested systems. Urie Bronfenbrenner is perhaps the most famous, and he identifies 4 levels of the environment. There's also the competence environmental press theory, which emphasizes the match between competence and environmental press, which is the best for development. So thinking about the ecological and systems perspectives on development, microsystem is the first level, meso, exo, and macro. The microsystem are the reciprocal relationships between the parents and the child. And so in this context, we're thinking about this parent-child interaction. The mesosystem, we're looking at the environment that forms the most immediate context around the parents and the children, which would be the friends in the school at this point. As we expand to the exosystem, we are looking at a system whereby the child will not actually or may not have much, if or even any, context. So we can think about the parent's social network, their friend group, which might not include their children, places of employment, things like that. If the parents are going back to school, all those would be components and part of the exosystem. And then at the highest level, we can see the macro system, which is which would be the value level with the ethnic group, the culture, and/or historical perspectives. Now, these are all reciprocal, where the parents' places of importance highly influence, for example, historical events, culture, and the ethnic group, but it's vice versa, right? There's this reciprocity, and then we can see how these things influence down and up as well. So we can think about this kind of like the way that an old school analog watch would look, with the various nested gears, and as they turn, it turn, as the second hand turns, 60 turns on the second hand creates 1 turn on the minute, right? And as those nested circles of gears expand and go down and mutually influence one another, that's the idea, central idea of this ecological approach. And it's important to remember because it helps us to locate and remember that human development is nested in a very important context, or multiple contexts, and how those things can culminate in developmental flourishing and support, but also it can cause constraints and be liabilities for human development as well. And so an important question to think about from the lifespan perspective is, how can we understand a person without understanding where they're coming from, right? So development cannot be understood in the scope of one framework. So we need to appreciate all these nested contexts. We need to have an appreciation for biological forces, psychological forces, life cycle forces, and social perspectives as well, as we try to understand human development. So 4 central features of this perspective: multidirectionality, right? So mutual and reciprocal relationships, pointing towards similar outcomes. Plasticity, things are very fluid and flexible. Historical context matters, and there are multiple causes leading up to or culminating in specific events or specific skills being attained or competencies being attained. And so another perspective on lifespan development is selective optimization with compensation. So as people gain skills, people learn how to maximize them. This is especially related to aging. So, for example, if we're looking at, for example, an older piano player, and so what they can do is they're thinking about and relying on their experiences and playing a piece. Now, of course, maybe their fingers and their reaction times aren't as quick because they're older. What they can do is they can play the rest of a piece at a slower timing, and then when it gets to a faster timing, they can play it at a more normal speed. But the overall result, for example, would be that they are able to demonstrate an increase in speed that's reflected in the score that they're playing, but they aren't playing from normal to fast. They're playing from slower to more normal, right? And so that's how they selectively optimize using their experience, their understanding, and they compensate for challenges that they're facing, maybe reaction times, maybe the ability of their fingers to play faster. So that's one way to approach a competence perspective. Life course perspective discusses how various generations experience biopsychosocial forces. And this perspective talks about the interplay between individual and society, that kind of thing. So here is a chart, the big picture, about these various theories and how they are related to the biopsychosocial approach. And here's some perspectives on their nature-nurture interaction and some of the other perspectives. Now, this last column of this chart is one of the ones that will be important as we talk about a Christian perspective on human development, as it outlines some of their positions on developmental issues, or their developmental teleology, as we talked about earlier. So the psychodynamic perspective, Erikson, personality is a key force, and then we can see that there are these emphases and things like that, and how there's an interaction between nature and nurture. It's a discontinuous model, right? The stages, and it's a universal sequence of stages, more so than context specific. There's learning approaches, cognitive development, as we talked about those 3 that way. So keep those developmental meta perspectives in mind. Because that speaks to the value, right, the goal, or the macro-systemic perspective that's emphasized. And here's the rest of the table, looking at ecological and systems approaches, and then lifespan and life course theory. So now we should shift into more empirical perspectives on human development. And so 4 approaches to doing developmental research. Looks at systematic observation, sampling behavior with specific tasks, self-reports, and then, of course, physiological measures. So, in terms of systematic observation, that's like the goal of science. That's what science tries to do, is very specifically, systematically observe, identify, gather data on specific information. So systematic observation is the highest level here. In naturalistic sense, the research will go into the environment to observe people's natural behavior. At the mall, at the school, at the home if they can. And so we try to capture that instance in that moment. And so that the researcher becomes part of that environment, which is a huge benefit, where we get to see what people really do in the wild, quote unquote. However, it's difficult to use with behaviors that are rare or typically occur in private settings. Right? So, especially if people know they're being observed, then important behaviors might be difficult to observe, like arguing or stuff like that, because the people might have a social bias to not do those things in public. Structured observations, these can be used to study behaviors that are rare or that typically occur in private settings, so they could be bring someone into a laboratory to kind of try to replicate the environment, and so that way that the person can engage in those behaviors, quote unquote, live, but it's in the environment. However, this could be the challenges could be that changing the setting from private to more public can influence the observation. So we need to be aware of that limitation. Sampling behavior with tasks. This is very convenient, and we can use this to study most behaviors. This might be an invalid approach if the task does not sample the behavior as it occurs naturally. So we would ask the person to demonstrate such and such behavior. Self-report is very popular in psychology research. We ask people to report generally on their behaviors. However, one of the challenges with self-reports is that people might over-report doing more positive things and under-report doing more negative things. For example, so physiological measures are very popular, especially in talking about the biological influences on human development. The challenge, there are 2 challenges here. One is that physiological measures are very expensive. Hooking electrodes up to people, things like that. So they're very expensive kind of way to study things, number one. Number two, a lot of infant research, for example, they will tie sensors to pacifiers, and they will measure things like frequency of sucking behavior and the pressure, the intensity, right? How much suck force, right, is being put on the pacifier. The challenge with these kinds of approaches is how do we get from that sucking behavior, which is highly instinctual, and then talk about how that relates to things like attachment and safety, anxiety in the infant. Right, so we can't really correlate those things, and so moving from a physiological measure to a more psychological measure in terms of fear, safety, that kind of stuff is challenging to say the least. But physiological measures are often used. So in doing the research, we must demonstrate that our chosen method is reliable. We get consistent results over time. And then we need to talk about the validity, which is the accuracy of our measures, right? How well does this approach give us consistent results, reliability, and then how representative or accurate is our measure? And yes, a measure can be reliable but not valid. So to think about this in terms of the easiest metaphor for understanding reliability and validity is a firearm metaphor. So for example, when you buy a firearm, the first thing to do is to ensure that the sights are it's sighted in, right? That when you aim the firearm, that you're able to hit the bullseye. Now, the steps of sighting in a firearm are to go to the firing range, and first off, you want to get a consistent pattern of shots. You want all of your shots to be within like a quarter in a quarter circle, or maybe a 50-cent piece, depending on how skillful you are. Right? But you want to have consistent results, making sure that you hit the target in relatively the same space at the same as you shoot. Once you've done that, then you worry about getting to the center of the target, or the bullseye. Right, so reliability tells us about the consistency, validity, helps us to understand that we are actually hitting the bullseye. We're being accurate in our measurement of the construct in question. Human development researchers rely on two primary designs: correlational studies, where we talk about the relationships between variables that exist, and statistically, that correlational designs result in correlational coefficients, and the statistical tool of a correlation results in a relationship of -1 to 1. The correlations can vary, and negative indicates a negative relationship or an inverse relationship, where increases in one variable are associated with decreases in another. And of course, positive, which would be increases in one variable, would be related to increases in another variable. And then there are no correlation, or a correlation of 0, which would mean there would be no relationship between the variables. And then there are experimental studies where there's actual manipulation of independent variables to cause particular behaviors. Now, in terms of human development, this is a little bit more challenging because of the embedded context. However, a lot of the attachment research was done in laboratory settings, and there were manipulation of variables. So it is a very important component of human development research. Here's a table laying out some of the things that we've discussed. We also want to talk about longitudinal designs, which is really a hugely important way to study human development, although it's very expensive, where one group of people is followed throughout the course of throughout a period of their life, or time frame, or their entire life. And so what it helps us to identify is we can track the influence of culture, society, and history on how people change over the course of time following a specific group of people. Now, some of the downsides of this approach is it's expensive and people drop out. And so what we want to make sure is, when we're looking at longitudinal studies, that there isn't a systematic bias, or there aren't systematic differences between the people that remain in the study and those that drop out. If that is in fact the case, that could limit or invalidate the study. The cross-sectional approach is where we purposely sample to grab as many different people in different age groups at the same time and compare them in terms of a cross-section. This is more convenient in that it addresses the attrition rates, or the dropout rates. The challenge with cross-sectional approaches is that it's not as accurate in helping us tease out historical lifespan events over the course of time. A sequential approach is also very expensive, and it allows us to test multiple groups of people over time. And this is kind of like having a multiple longitudinal or cross-sectional design. However, like I said, it's very, very, very expensive to engage with. So this lecture provides the framework or foundation for the remaining parts of the class in terms of evaluating the research. Developmental teleology is one of the most important things that you will learn in this class. So please be attentive to that. And as we tease apart nature versus nurture, continuous versus discontinuous change, those kinds of perspectives that are inherent in developmental theory, keep that in mind as we begin to engage in the future in terms of a Christian worldview perspective on human development. This concludes our lecture for week 1. And if you have any questions, please email me at tfrederick@calbaptist.edu.